Good evening, everyone, to our third Zoom recording. I welcome you all to the Brain and Behavior Unit. So what we're going to do today is slightly different from last week, but mostly the same. I'm going to just take a moment to go to highlight a few slides. If you haven't muted yourself, please do so. Thank you. We'll take a few minutes to go over some slides I wanted to highlight, and then we'll have a similar Q&A discussion like we did last week. I'm really interested to see how this week's CTE experience was for you, and how you're seeing that this week's material is building on last week's material. All of these units are structured, they build on each other. And so really looking forward to hearing from you all on that. A couple of housekeeping items. I'm going to share my screen with you all. So I wanted to point out with you, to you, that I posted a folder that I sent an announcement for a couple of days ago. And I imagine that you all may have not had a chance to look this over yet, but please do so kind of before you wrap up this unit. It's really exciting. This Neuro for Therapists guest lecture yesterday in our face-to-face neuro class, a very recent graduate, May of this year, Taylor Gautier, she provided it's about 30-minute guest lecture on neurotransmitters and neuromodulators that are relevant to the brain and behavior. And this is a new addition to this unit. It's the first time we've presented this, but I'm very, very excited about it because she, as you will see from the video, she's pretty funny. Taylor is exceptionally passionate about this and really did yeoman's work in trying to translate this material specifically for clinical practice. And so she goes over a number, not all, but a number of the neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, and a few hormones that you all will probably come across and need to know about as you progress in your clinical practice, especially if you're in the behavioral health field with serious mental illness or addiction. So one of the really interesting things she did over the last semester, this past spring, was she developed this Neuro for Therapists blog. And this will be useful for you moving forward because it really, it brings together and synthesizes a lot of research on different neurotransmitters and especially on different medications. And I imagine that many of you all will have clients that will be on different medications. So this is a resource for you. I don't expect you to read, every little, blog entry on there, but it would be helpful to bookmark this page for future reference. Just kind of check it out, spend a few minutes looking at it, and know that it's there for future reference. One of the things that she did point out was that she had a number of folks that had diagnoses that were actually following her blog. And so it may actually be something that would be useful, not just for you, but for your clients as well. So essentially this folder contains the 30-minute recording. It has the slides kind of laid over the top of it. Hopefully that's pretty accurate, but the slides are here for you to download as well. And she has a number of notes if you want to view the notes page in here that may cover a lot of things or reiterate things that she kind of talks pretty fast. So you can, and it can essentially on each slide read some more information that she may have not covered in that 30-minute lecture. So really excited to promote this student's work and with other students, and it was one of those things that hopefully will inspire you all. I keep on talking about, do what you're passionate about. Taylor just kind of did what she was passionate about, really kind of took the ball and ran with it. So really excited to share all that with you. One other thing to point out is just a reminder that next week is our very last Zoom session on that Wednesday. I think it's the 29th. And then the fifth week, that July 6th, We will not have a Zoom session, but you will essentially have an online class and online responsibilities for that week. There's a couple of documentaries for you to view, and the lecture material that I will be posting probably next week. So are there any kind of general questions before I get started? Okay, so I'll just probably take about 5 or so minutes. I just wanted to kind of check in on a few things, and again, this will be a lot of review from Dr. Combs-Orm's lecture, who hopefully you've watched that already. But you know, one of the critical things with the brain, which is essentially relates to behavior, is the concept of not the concept, but the existence of synapses. And you can see the picture in the lower right hand corner here. And actually on Taylor's lecture, she goes into a lot more detail. It's one of the reasons I wanted her to bring her in, is you'll have some time to sit with, and she has some pretty great graphics that are a lot better than this one, that explain the different functions of the different parts of these neurons. So this is essentially a neuron. The long yellow kind of tube looking things are axons. The tree-like structures are dendrites, and then this part here is, I can actually forward it, this is a little bigger. This kind of synaptic cleft is really where a lot of the action happens. This is really where the electricity, this whole thing, like you can see here, is really considered the synapse, where these dendrites are connecting to these axons. And so there are chemicals like these neurotransmitters that are released and go back and forth. And when these connections happen, they're essentially electric currents. They do, that's really how connections are formed, and how, or essentially neurons are formed when they communicate with each other. And that communication happens through the release and uptake of those neurotransmitters. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on that. Taylor talks about it for a few minutes in a little more detail. But she goes into this kind of chemical messages sort of cross over the synaptic cleft and get taken up by the other part of the cell. And so, you know, this kind of happens, you know, kind of over and then over and then over again. And you make, and eventually the more communication happens, the more, the stronger those connections are. And then that's really essentially the foundation of development in terms of, you know, how we grow, the language that we speak, and all of the connections that are made are formed by experience. So I think I mentioned in the first class that all of development is based, is experience dependent, is based on experience. So that's why this whole nature-nurture debate or conversation is pretty much over by now, as we know more about brain science and we understand that, you know, that it's both. It's always going to be both. It's always been both. So the communication that happens within the synapses begins in utero and continues throughout life. So the more you repeat an experience, that is what's strengthening these synapses, like when you learn how to ride a bike, like when you learn how to drive a car. And those that are not used weaken and die. And that is a natural process called apoptosis, which I know Dr. Combs-Orm went over. Moving on a little bit about neuroplasticity. Again, I'm just kind of going over some of the key things from this unit. This is the ability of the brain to change in actual structure, which then will result in behavior. And the structure change happens in response to your individual and social experiences and your environment. The highest kind of the time when we say that you're most plastic is from conception up to about age 3. but your brain remains plastic throughout life. The second most plastic period is in adolescence, which many of you all, I'm sure, covered in your CTE. And the other piece with this is that neurons that fire together wire together, and that's really, that's just kind of the saying that we have, and it's really, really important. So I'm going to kind of skip over this part a little bit, but essentially this is kind of the wiring that you see happened. And the easier it is, communication flows faster, it's stronger, it's more efficient through, when you have these kind of fatty layers of myelin over the axon. And remember that yellow tube piece of the neuron called the axon, that's the axon represented here. And this is really important. It can be influenced by things like diet and exercise, and is also implicated in neurodegenerative diseases like multiple sclerosis. When these connections are not strong, like as is depicted here. So this is something that's important just for ongoing life and development. So I don't want to get into too much about the brain structure, because I imagine you all read about this and also saw in the video, but the key thing here is that development happens from our most, from an evolutionary standpoint, from how we were millions and millions of years ago, which we're essentially starts with the brain stem, and then you have the brain here that develops. And so from very early on, this is essentially our kind of reptilian brain, and then we get more and more sophisticated down here until our brain is essentially complete, and all of our neurons are present for the most part at birth. And this is just kind of the same thing, just in a little bit more detail here. So the biggest thing here, as we'll talk about, is the prefrontal cortex, which is here, is the very last thing to develop. So when you think about the brain developing from the bottom up and the inside out, our forebrain, the very front part here, is really, it's literally the very last part of your brain to develop, and it is not, your brain is really not done growing and is not really fully complete until you're about age 25. So we have a whole new, all of this brain science is introducing a lot of conversations around adolescence and adolescent behavior, especially when it comes to policy issues like juvenile justice, mental health treatment, things like that, become really, really important the more that we know. So if you are going to be working with children and adolescents, this is one of those key things. Or if you have children, this is a really big deal. Teenagers act the way they do for a reason. So the last thing I want to highlight, which is really one of the critical things here, is this idea of pruning, and this goes back to the neurons that fire together, wire together. And again, these synapses are strengthened by experience. So remember that. And those that are not used are pruned, are lost, just like you would prune a tree, and it kind of shapes a certain way. So then those branches that you cut off, or those leaves that you cut off, they go away and they're not there anymore. So they may grow back, and then they may get pruned again. So this is an ongoing process that's happening over and over and over again. And again, those that are used frequently are strengthened, or essentially kind of wired together. And this is a very normal part of development. So one thing I wanted to highlight here, that the concept of pruning is normal and necessary, but because it is experience dependent, it can go many different ways. So if you look here, you've got at 3 months some connections that are, they're happening, they're existing. I imagine that these are things like, when I cry, I get fed, and things like that. At 6 years, because of the depth and breadth of experience between 3 months and 6 years. And again, you know, your brain triples in size between birth and 3 years of age. So there's just a massive amount of connections that are happening. So this is huge. This is, there's just a lot going on. You can see a lot of these kind of tree trunks. These are these really strong synaptic connections. This is this whole, you know, neurons that fire together, wire together. And then you can see here in adulthood that many of these connections that existed at 6 years just simply have been pruned away. They've been cut back because they haven't been needed. There are things that were really important when you were 8 or 9 years old that just cease to be important, or you've kind of found a quicker, more efficient way to process that information or do that task. And so you've done it over and over and over again. And so things just look a different way. Again, just reflecting on the experience dependent piece, adolescence is a really critical time for a lot of these connections to be made. And again, it's the second most plastic period of our lives, and which means we're the most changeable and things get the most fixed in that time. And one example is that if you are as a teenager or adolescent for, you know, kind of years on end, you spend a lot of time essentially as a couch potato. If you're playing video games, watching TV, hanging out with your friends, and just, you know, pretty sedentary, not, you know, doing a lot of exercise or other activity, your brain will actually get wired that way. And you will take that from adolescence into the rest of your life, which becomes, so if you were sedentary as a young adult or an adolescent, it's much harder to break those patterns simply because of the architecture of your brain and what happens during those years. So it is possible to change, but it does make it a lot harder. And another thing here is to remember that very positive things can get wired, like when I cry, when I'm upset, I have a caregiver that comforts me. You know, my needs are met. I learn to trust adults. These are the kinds of connections that get made and that really do lead down the road to behavior. The similar connections with, like, if I cry, I get hit, or if I act a certain way, I will, you know, not get fed, or my neighborhood is very dangerous, so I'm constantly in fear for my safety, you know, every single day of my life growing up. Or maybe there's domestic violence within the household, things like that. Those are the connections that get made as well. So as an adult, if you've kind of from 3 months then to 6 years into 12 years and on into adulthood, if the connections are being made early in your life, those are the connections that are going to be present as an adult. And those things can be very, very challenged to reverse. It is possible, but it can be very, very challenging. And lastly, this is, again, because these units build on each other, I want you guys to remember the conversation about these neural connections when we get to the stress and hormones unit next week, because they really do become even more important when we talk about trauma and stress. So I am going to stop there and ask you all to... let me get back. Try to find the screen. Okay. Anyway, so I would like to open up the conversation to the CTE and invite you all to talk a little bit about what you came up with. If you had any questions. Were there particular aspects of this that were harder to write? Some of my face-to-face students thought that this week's CTE was a little harder than last week. So I'm curious if you think the same thing. So just kind of open floor for now. Who's up to bat first? I can be patient, but eventually I'll start calling on you.
I'll say that I thought this CTE this week was much harder than last week.
Okay.
Not really, sorry, my daughter's loud, but not understanding the information, but more so trying to put it on paper and like write it out, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Was there something that could have been more helpful, or it was just more of a kind of a process issue for you?
It was more the process issue of trying to find ways, because my husband always proofreads stuff for me, and so I can explain it to him. But when I'm putting it on paper, I'm like, why can't I say it on paper like I can say it when I'm talking? But the one particular thing was the gray and white matter.
Yeah.
I felt like that was the hardest to talk about.
Yes. So, okay. Does anybody else have questions? I think I have some slides. We can spend some time going over that. Does anybody else have questions about the gray and white matter?
I don't have any questions about the gray and white matter, but I agree with Cassie that adding the gray and white matter part into the paper was the hardest thing, because it's like, I guess it was just a little bit harder to explain to the parents about that, because it's like there's really not much else I can say, because it's hard to predict. It's hard to say this is what's going to happen. So like when you're adding in the gray matter, it's like, yeah, it really could affect functioning, but that's just hard to explain.
Well, and I think that's a great point, and I think that this is this CTE as all of the CTE, as social workers, when you're in the field, you are really going to be challenged to work with limited information. And with something like a brain injury, even the physicians, you don't know how that injury is going to heal over time. You don't know what, because all of that healing is also experience dependent. Because when you think about it, if you have a brain injury and there are connections lost, it's going to take some time for those connections to rebuild. And they're going to get, the connections that are the most frequent are the ones that are going to be the strongest. So, so that happens with healing. If you could put your screen on mute, that would be great. So one of the things is simply just dealing with, kind of explaining to parents that we simply don't know. This is what we know about the brain, and here's some, education. You can educate them about the different aspects of the brain, but you also along with the parents are challenged to live in a space of uncertainty. You just simply don't know how it's going to transpire. So I didn't, for the CTE, necessarily expect you to kind of predict or dictate, what would happen, but simply state that, these are the issues at play. Does that help at all?
Yeah, that helps, and I think that was okay with the paper. I definitely recognize that we weren't expected to predict it. So explaining the other things wasn't hard. I think it was just getting them all in there in 250 words is probably where I'm coming from.
That's always the thing. That's always the thing. I try to be really reasonable when I'm grading them.
Thanks.
I can see the effort. I can see the effort, and I can see it when it's there. I can see it when it's not there. So I take all that into consideration. Great, thanks. Also, you all, I'll just be honest with y'all, we here are, we're always trying to make improvements with, how we deliver course material. And this is the first time that we have, that we're essentially experimenting with having basically, I hate to say dictating, but asking, where I bold and highlight the vocabulary terms. Normally we don't, in the past we haven't done that, but sometimes, we'd wind up with CTEs with like one. So we're really trying to even the playing field and ask you guys to really get those critical ones in there. So I'm a big fan of CQI, and so over time, if I see that it's harder to do that, I may not do that in the future. So I appreciate you guys rolling with me and doing the best you can, because I think it sometimes helps to have a little additional direction. So that was the effort there. or the intention there. Okay. Any other comments about that particular issue? If this one was harder, or it was just harder to kind of try to get all those vocabulary terms in there?
Well, I think some of it might depend on what we get when we get the grades back. Because I know one of the critiques I had was using language you would use with the parents.
Right.
So instead of putting in things like the actual terminology for the critical period, I explained that a 17-year-old's brain is still developing, and especially the areas of the prefrontal cortex in that particular adolescent. So I tried to go for less particular terms and more, this is what it is.
Right, and I think that makes sense. And I think, kind of like I said a couple weeks ago, if you use a term correctly, or use a concept correctly in a sentence or within context appropriately, then you are communicating the term, even if you don't use that term exactly, because, we're not necessarily going to use, we may say something like epigenetics eventually. We would definitely say the prefrontal cortex, because that's just a specific part of your brain. You can have an actual, a model brain and point, just like you would with your wrist or something. So that's not necessarily kind of too unexpected, but definitely getting into, gray matter and white matter and some of those other kind of more, in synaptogenesis and things like that, I wouldn't expect you all to use kind of those highly technical terms. It gets very jargony in a lot of ways, but those, I wouldn't expect in a practice setting for you all to use those terms. So I think it's important to figure out, what do those terms actually mean, and then how can you translate that meaning to, in a way that the parents can actually, take home and understand and use. So, good. And again, it's like each week, it's like, how can you do it better? How can you do it better? How can you improve on what you did? So good. I'm glad that feedback was helpful, or challenging, I guess. Okay, any other comments?
I find the CTE a little more interesting, partly because of my hearing disability and my experiences. I had to retrain my brain how to not to use my ear, but use my technology to help me hear, and kind of looking for environmental cues to help me hear better. And looking at the CTE, it was a little interesting how to say environment plus intervention is really key to recovery from a traumatic brain injury or something like a disability from the brain. I had essential hearing loss, and going through 16 years of speech therapy finally helped me be the person who I am today. So that's a comment.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's an excellent example of, and a very real world and personal example of how I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I guess I'll ask you a question. So did you find it, and maybe this is just what you were saying, but did you feel yourself applying this information and thinking about synaptogenesis and making those connections and the neurons that wire together? Did you apply that to your own experience, knowing that you had to essentially restructure your brain in order to move forward in a new way?
It's definitely open eye to why certain things happen, or why certain brains work in a certain way because trauma, or partly because it's a birth defect and the brain just works that way. It's just open eyes for me. I was a little confused for so many years why one brain looks normal, and for me, I had no idea what my diagnosis is, and so I was a little puzzled by it. But having to read all the articles, it made me realize that could explain why certain things happen the way they do.
Absolutely. And, you had talked about having this issue since birth, and I won't put you on the spot anymore, but thank you for that. You know, one of the other key concepts from this unit was the idea of, you know, critical periods versus sensitive periods. And with things like the development of language, the development of eyesight, the development of hearing, those kind of core things that are happening in the first 3 years of life, which you definitely saw with that amazing TED Talk, The Genius of Babies. I'm floored by that video. I hope you all liked it as much as I did. Thinking about that, you know, if you don't, with those critical periods, if you don't use it, you will lose it. And so, you know, things to be able to recover from that. I mean, they actually found, and I sort of shudder to think how they know this, but, you know, with babies, if they, for some reason, you know, like they have a fully functioning eye, and if they have a patch over their eye, like maybe they had to have surgery or something, if that's, you know, too long, they will cease to be able to see in that eye. And if you miss that window, you have missed that window. And the same is true for, you know, hearing and speech and language development. That's why when you think about, you know, it's extremely rare, but those interesting cases of children who were, you know, raised with animals, or who were just, or who were, you know, isolated from other humans for a very long time, their language is just, it's just simply not there. And go ahead.
Which is why I wanted to bring back your comment is be able to recover something is possible, but it's going to take a really, I don't know, a lot of your effort and time to be able to be or to recover from something like that.
Mm-hmm. That's huge. That's huge, and it's certainly a testament to your personal strength, will, and determination. And it's fabulous that you're here with us and can offer your perspective. So going back to the CTE, what were some of the key points that you all covered in your CTE? You know, when you think about, you know, what would you tell the parents? So, you know, without actually reading your CTE, but who would like to volunteer kind of some of their key points that they wanted to share with the parents?
Definitely what the adolescent was at risk for, if you're talking about the emotional and physical trauma they've gone through. So they'll be, especially in the short term, more at risk for anxiety, irritability, suicidal thoughts and actions, and developing depression, possibly aggressive behaviors, and at risk for other things later on in life. And as well, especially because their son was 17, the fact that as an adolescent his prefrontal cortex is still developing and still sort of in that sensitive period, so he has a chance through experience and through therapy and rehabilitation efforts to recover. So I kept it hopefully a little hopeful.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. We always want to, you know, hope is the great game changer. So we definitely always want to instill hope when we can, certainly when we're talking about behavior change. Good, excellent. Who else would like to add to Lauren's comment? I know there's some.
I agree with what I'm sorry.
No,
I
go
agree
ahead.
with what you just stated. It was the CTE was extremely kind of difficult for me this week. Not, I guess because I'm just learning to minimize what I need to say to the family. But I too wanted to use all of the vocabulary to explain therapy. So I did it first in words, and I had like 400 and something words. So then I had to go back and chop out, and I was just like, oh my God, I was freaking out about it because I wanted the family to really understand, because it is a hard period, and what seems now may not be the case later, or even through rehabilitation, he could always have a setback, which you don't want to tell the family that, but you want to explain to them the different things that could possibly come in the near future. Just from like dealing with a case like this once before, and that I was also wanting to address the situations with the substance abuse issue that could possibly happen, because it is a young, at 17 years old, they still don't know themselves. They're hormonal. as well as with just society and peers. So I wanted the family to understand that and be supportive at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like you punch them, but then you want to hug them.
Yeah.
You know, it's
yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. That's really good. And I think, I imagine you're not the only one who was struggling with the, number of words that you wanted to tell. And again, I'm certainly not suggesting that when you met with a parent, you would only, offer them 250 words. That's certainly not how it goes in the real world. But but just to be able to focus on streamlining, synthesizing, it's really about, what is that cream that rises to the top? What is the very most important thing? So it sounds like you definitely, put a lot of work into it. I'm sure that there was a lot of good information. And I think, and it also begs the question, in a real world scenario, in a practice setting, what kind of, fact sheets or talking points or resource pages or websites would you want to have on hand, for this or a similar issue, essentially TBI? There was a lot of, you had a whole article on TBI. So thinking about how, what would you want to have at your fingertips? So even if you only had 15 minutes to meet with the family or an hour to meet with the family, you could say a lot, but I'm sure it would be very overwhelming, and you might want to be, able to hand them kind of a packet of resources. So just, you may not have to say everything in the CTE, but you could potentially reference some types of resources which you would want to have at your disposal to be able to share with the family. Like some of those positive interventions they could do at home, or anything like that, like those risks, or if you kind of gave them a list of potential risks, you would want to give them, resources or kind of supportive materials for each of those risks. So if they're at risk for, substance abuse, then you would want to have some more information on hand around substance abuse in adolescence that they could review at a later time. Does that make sense? Okay. Good.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Okay, good. What are some of the other key points that would be important to share with the parents?
I felt that it was important to share that hope is not lost with them, because I could tell they were really worried about very specific things. And based off of what we've learned about the brain and how synapses work and how plasticity is a thing, I really tried to focus on the fact that hope wasn't lost, and these are the things that you can do to help support him, so that the best things for coming in from the environment, the best things can happen for him and his brain, because I think that they were just really worried about specific things. So I wanted to make sure that they understood that there were things that they could do to help support him, rather than just kind of sit back and wait, because I'm sure that's what physicians will probably tell them. They wouldn't be as thorough as a social worker would about how they're feeling. They would just say, we really don't know. We just have to wait and see. So I suggested that they, definitely follow through with any type of therapy that was suggested by a physician, but also remembering that they know their child better than anybody else, and they know, what he thrives off of, and to just encourage autonomy to help him stay positive because of the specific part of his brain that was affected, which can cause that, like we read in that TBI article, most likely irritability and changes. So that's what I focused on.
Right. Megan, that's excellent. Thank you for that. Figuring out, and I love that point about, the unique role of social workers, especially within a medical setting, which you would be on potentially, hopefully, in an ideal world, would be on multidisciplinary teams to help support someone with a brain injury, especially a young person. And, where the physicians may be, okay, we'll see you back for a checkup in 3 months or 4 months or 6 months, or, there's a lot that's going to be happening within that time frame that social workers could have an impact on. And I think that hope and that positivity and really kind of strengths perspective as a frame for supporting the adolescent and his family really can make all the difference. And and even kind of normalizing. Did you all, can somebody share with me how many TBIs there are every year in America?
1.5 million.
Yes. That's a lot of people. That is not 5. That is a huge amount. That's a huge amount of people. And, so even just as part of that conversation of, adolescence is one of those really intense, because of those hormones and lots of body changes and lots of brain changes, behavior changes, feeling quote unquote normal or feeling different, feeling the other, could be a real critical issue. So if it's like, I was fine, I was playing sports, I was doing all this stuff, I was hanging with my friends, and then all of a sudden my entire life changed overnight. And so I don't feel normal anymore. I don't feel like just one of the guys. I don't feel, like I don't understand my place in the world all of a sudden. That can be a really traumatic situation. So figuring out how to normalize, educate, inform, support, all of that can be really important in a practice setting. Good. So what are some of the functions of the prefrontal cortex that you would share with the parents? Who wants to tell me about the good old PFC and what it does and does not do?
I broke down some of the executive functioning. Someone else want to go? I talk a lot.
Sure, I did hear. I think I heard somebody.
Yes, organizational thought, mood, memory.
What does the PFC do, like, kind of in relation to other parts of the brain? How does it
Kind of like the CEO, I think, is what Dr. Coombs-Orn was talking about. She said it was the CEO of the brain.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's really important. Can you imagine a 17-year-old sort of with a partially functioning CEO? When you think about how well is that company running? What's going on with that, with the board? What kind of communication is there? So it really, it's calling the shots. So there's one thing that I'm kind of waiting for somebody to say. So does somebody else want to say a little bit more about the PFC?
Well, there's decision making. There's a bit for voluntary motor skills. Also, if it's in the prefrontal cortex, especially after a head injury and a car accident, you want to be careful about potential issues with speech and writing, as well as other voluntary motor, because there's the Broca's area and a couple other things in there that can definitely be impacted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So having a fully was somebody else going to go?
Yeah, I was going to say memory retention and concentration are also affected when that area is damaged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So it's important to think, to really, so if you've got a brain, so let's just kind of unpack this a little bit. If you've got an adolescent brain, we know that the CEO isn't really going to be fully online for another 5 to 7 years, or even 8 years. What can we expect during that time? I mean, what are going to be some of those critical things if you talk about, memory, talk about, well, really that CEO function, that decision making, higher order thinking, and really it's the prefrontal cortex. You think about it, CEO. I also think about it as the great inhibitor. It is your prefrontal cortex is why, and I know that y'all can relate, why you will do things as an 18-year-old you just would absolutely not do as a 28-year-old, and you definitely probably wouldn't do as a 38-year-old. There are some very good reasons for that, and so in those teenage years, if you kind of take that, if you damage that part that is helping you to inhibit yourself, and specifically things like your amygdala, which is all about sex and aggression. So if you kind of take away the great inhibitor, or you take away the decision maker, or the CEO, or the thing that's really helping us, especially when we talk about stress and trauma, it's helping us to say, hey, it's okay. It's all good here. That's not actually a lion. It's just a leaf, or whatever. It's really helping you to kind of keep yourself in check. And so if you, as a 17-year-old, don't have it fully online anyway, and then it gets damaged, and so you're having to kind of heal it, there could be some really complex issues, which is why you've got some of those things like irritability and, potentially kind of abnormal or somewhat aggressive behaviors. It's just, the inhibitor is kind of out to lunch. So, but at the same time, you really want to be supporting, having a nurturing environment, having whatever occupational therapy, or like someone said earlier, do whatever exercises or treatment services that the physician recommends. But then also really supporting that autonomy, because the 17-year-old is still a 17-year-old. They still need to do normal 17-year-old things as much as possible. So figuring out how to balance that and make all of that work will be interesting, which is why being fully informed about the different parts of the brain and the different responsibilities and functions that they have are going to be important for you all in practice.
One thing we didn't mention yet that I thought was pretty important was the different ways the brain heals, especially because you're coming in with two parents that you said are educated but don't know anything about neuroscience. So I made sure to mention the difference between the spontaneous recovery after an accident or brain injury and the other forms of recovery where the brain is compensating and creating new pathways and functioning.
Yeah, absolutely. And that whole compensation piece, the spontaneous piece is going to be, pretty immediate, but that, those workarounds or those new connections that are made, that's really one of the reasons, and I think it was in the reading, was why brain injuries are you really have to do a wait and see approach for about a year. Because it's going to take that amount of time for folks to get a better understanding of how that healing, what is the outcome of that healing essentially. So I like the idea of social workers being able to provide support for the adolescent and the family throughout that year-long waiting period. I mean, just the simple, waiting, I don't know what's going to happen, and it can be very, very stressful. Did you have your hand up, or are you just scratching your head? I didn't know. Okay. I saw a hand, so I'm always like looking for a hand. Just as a personal example, I had my best friend actually suffered a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, which actually essentially was a through and through right in her prefrontal cortex, and she survived that. And it was a very long, and she was 18 years old when that happened, and it was a very long road for everyone, her family, her loved ones, everybody who cared about her to just basically figure out what was going to happen. And she she was like a poster child for, brain, basically it was a traumatic brain injury and what could happen. And she went from being, totally non-functional to being, verbal, to be able to move around. She was definitely physically compromised, but the difference between, the time of the accident and fast forward 1 year and then even 2 years out and then even 3 years out, was absolutely incredible. And it was fascinating to me to see, how she was able to compensate and make those, those different connections, and just even things like she couldn't really use the right side of her body very much, but her kind of whole left shoulder and left arm and most of her left side was became like extremely strong. So, you know, she would hug you and you would feel like you were going to like choke because she was so strong. And it was because, again, it was that whole kind of compensation. So she couldn't, you know, use the right side anymore. So that then the left side's going to get stronger. And it was interesting, just as another editorial, is that even right after the accident, her personality was very much intact. And I found that very fascinating, especially reflecting on all of the brain information, to think, well, yeah, that, you know, that makes sense. She definitely was very uninhibited for a while, but her personality definitely was still there even after that traumatic brain injury. So thinking about, you know, so even conversations for, you know, going back to the CTE is like kind of normalizing it to a certain degree. You know, what are those things that, you know, what are those things that are the same? So everything, okay, I had this injury, now everything's different, but what are those things that are still me? I'm still here. You know, how can I bring, you know, my own gifts and talents, you know, to help me heal through this process? And that, again, is really kind of focuses on that strengths perspective. So I digress. Thank you for your letting me do that. Okay, what are some other comments? Who has some other ideas about, you know, either how the PFC relates to healing, or how we can think about how to support the client, or what you would want to tell the parents in this situation?
Well,
Sorry.
say, hi. I want to say that I think I love the fact that, am I upside down?
You're sideways. That's okay.
I love the fact that we're I know the neurons, and as long as a person is active or continually is active and constantly learning, then even though the brain, or even though trauma happens, then new activity, new experiences, new learning will cause the brain to kind of spill over and it can become back normal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's critical. And, you know, I kind of think about that as also like the first 3 years of life, you know, with everything being so experience dependent, you know, you want to be really careful about how you develop that structure, or that environment that person is trying to heal and grow in. There you are, you're right side up now. You know, and so it's very similar. Obviously, it's not as plastic a period, but it's just as important for a 17-year-old as it is for a 3-year-old. You want to make sure that environment is going to support that person in a developmentally appropriate way. So those things like autonomy and relationship with friends, all of those other things that you learned in your lifespan classes being important in adolescence will be important here too.
And it talked about also nourishing mothers, making sure they nurture babies, or even teenagers, or even grown people.
Yes.
Getting the nurse.
Yeah, we all need love. We all need love. That is very true. Good. Was there someone else who was going to add a comment?
Yeah, I found the TED video on the teenage brain and how it responds to reward systems really helpful. Mm-hmm. Kind of like going off that I was really happy that the CTE was on someone who is in a period of adolescence rather than, you know, someone who's maybe like a senior, because I feel like when you're 17, you know, from what we like learn in the readings and stuff, it's usually already like a highly stimulating environment, especially if you're going to school, or, you know, usually you like are having the odds of you being out in life and having a lot of new experiences that might be challenging are a lot higher, I feel, due to usually having more mobility and being around more people. But anyways, the reward system thing was really provocative to me as a like really practical way of intervening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And you also brought up the issue of, you know, which the CTE was also sort of trying to get at, was the, you know, how is the conversation with these parents going to go, given that he's 17 years old versus 37 years old? You know, are there differences? So I'm posing this question back to you all. Are there differences that you would need to explain, or, you know, the potentiality of the healing, and with what's going on at 17 versus an older age.
I saw, I can't remember, and I'm sorry, I'm at Starbucks again, so it's loud in here. I saw, I can't remember if it was in one of the articles or I don't know where, but it was talking about the correlation between a traumatic brain injury and developing dementia or Alzheimer's later in life. This happened to one of my family members. They got a traumatic brain injury and just were diagnosed last month with early onset Alzheimer's. Now, she said to me the other day that one of the things she wished someone had told her was that that was a potential risk down the line, because she settled for a lawsuit to help compensate for loss of income, but she did not compensate for the fact that she could potentially be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So that is something that she wished someone would have said to her.
Wow, that's huge. That's huge. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a really important point. It's not just about what's happening right now. It's about the impact of what could happen in the future. And next week, when we talk about ACEs, I mean, you think about adverse experiences in childhood and before 18. I mean, you're potentially setting yourself up for a reduction in life, as much as 20 years. 20 years. So, thinking about the future as well as the present is equally as important. Excellent point. Really good point. There was one other thing I wanted to go back to your comment about the reward system, and I just lost it. Okay, it's lost. It's not coming back. Oh well, probably wasn't that good. Are there any other comments?
I have a comment.
The only comment I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
You go.
Oh, I just want to thank you for sharing the video. The one where you showed us how our brain is intrigued by activity for the NBA Finals this weekend, and the big parade that went on, and how everybody was just grabbed in awe or the last minute of the game, where you could just see the emotions on everybody. It's like the audience was freezing. It made me think back to the video, and I'm glad I watched it before that happened, because it helped me understand.
Absolutely. I think you're referring to the one on mirror neurons, which was another point that was really critical for this, because it's really, again, goes back to that development is experience dependent and environmentally dependent. And so that whole kind of monkey see, monkey do, remember, it was like, I'm picking up the peanut and this is my brain firing, and then I'm watching you pick up the peanut and my brain is responding exactly the same way. So when that quarterback is tackled really hard, in that football game that we're watching, it's almost like we're feeling ourselves getting tackled, or we're empathizing to such a great degree that it's like we feel that energy, so it can become very addictive. And I think it's something that I find interesting that could be implicated with things like addiction to all kinds of things, and because if you see something, you want to experience it yourself. So really good point. Hunter, did you want to jump in there?
Oh, yeah. I just had a question about the CTE. It's something I've been struggling with.
Okay.
When I write it, usually I write it a couple of times, and then I'll have like a lot of vocab and stuff like that in there. And then I'll go back and read it, and I'll be thinking, this is something I'll never say to somebody, because it comes across as cold.
Right.
And so then I don't want to say dumb it down, but I proceed to take away a lot of that stuff and just try to get the meat in there. And then I feel like, I got to put empathetic statements in there too. And so by the time I do that, I don't have a lot of room left. It's just named vocabulary, and that's kind of the problem I've been having.
Yeah. I imagine you are not alone in that. I think that is the great challenge, and that's why, I do focus so much on that balance, and okay, sorry, I was just reading the comment. So we have the focus on the balance is really important, because that's where you are going to want to introduce some potentially empathetic statements, or you are going to want to show that you are connected to the context, which is that we're these parents are educated, but they don't know anything about neuroscience. They're, you know, potentially nervous about what's going to happen to their kid. They're worried about these behavior changes. So, you know, it is going to be helpful to have some language in there that shows that you are coming at this not as a physician, but as a social worker, because that's where we are. And but I think that you can do that in a way. I saw last week, I saw a couple of really good examples where there was just like even just one sentence at the beginning. You know, even just saying something as simple as your concerns are really valid. You know, you really don't necessarily have to go on and on and on with that piece. But it is, you know, this is one of those tricky assignments that I'm challenging you all to think, you know, from that practice perspective, but it's not, but you also do have to kind of tick off all of the requirements of the assignment, which you are being, you know, graded on. So it is sort of I am kind of putting you in a delicate balance. And as someone mentioned earlier, you know, you would want to be in this scenario, you would want to be telling that, you know, educating those parents, you know, as much as humanly possible. So it's going to be way, way, way more than 250 words. So I think it's one of those things, I guess my advice is, you know, do the best you can with that balance. And then at some point, just stop overthinking, and just sort of, you know, like if you've done it kind of once or twice, you know, you're probably good. I wouldn't I just wouldn't overanalyze it. I would just try your best to make sure that you've kind of hit the contextual pieces, hit the terminology pieces, and synthesize the material in such a way that I can see that you're really connecting these dots. And I think that's the best anybody can do. And there's, you know, like I said in my comments about last week's, you know, there's a broad range in, you know, writing quality, but everybody, well, not everybody, but, you know, most people sort of landed in like really a pretty good grade. I mean, overall, I was very, very impressed with your first ones kind of out of the gate. I was really, really happy because you never kind of know how it's going to go. And I was really, really pleased. So I think that, you know, you were on the right track. And I think I tried to provide some specific comments about how to either kind of bring you up to speed or take you to the next level. And so hopefully those were helpful for writing this week. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but.
It did. I know one thing I did different on this paper is I went out on a limb and I pulled some percentages from a government site. I think it was the Center for Prevention, just because I felt like that would have been kind of interesting for a kid to know, like, this is normal, this happens. So Absolutely. I wanted to make sure those numbers were out there. And I think it ended up being like 14% of car wrecks ended up in traumatic brain injury. And I just kind of want to put that out there for him. Mm-hmm. I felt like that was a way to put empathy out there, but also present some kind of evidence, you know.
Absolutely. I think that's perfect. Great.
Okay.
Love it. Yeah. Anytime you can go above and beyond, add something new that's, you know, within context and, you know, relates to the material, but kind of takes it to another level, that's great as well. Good job. All right. It is 6:33, being respectful of everybody's time. Are there any last parting words of wisdom or comments or questions that anybody has before we launch into the next unit? You all hopefully saw the quiz is up and ready for you. Has a few less questions.
Yes, I have one. Well, a comment, actually. I just want to say that I really, really enjoyed all the videos that you put on the site. They really helped tie into the reading that we're doing and made it more plainer, just to actually hear somebody voice saying it and then seeing it and reading PowerPoint. So I
absolutely. Thank you for saying that, because you're just reinforcing what I believe too. There's no way I think we could get through this dense material without some visuals and some you know, kind of hearing this from in different voices. So I agree. I think they add in a lot too.
Yes.
Okay, great. Anything else? As always, please feel free to email me if y'all have any questions about anything coming up this next week. I look forward to reviewing your papers. My goal is to have them done by Friday. I'm going to try really, really hard. Didn't make it, made it till Sunday this past weekend. Hopefully it won't take me that long, but it's a little bit busy for me right now, but I am going to do my best to get them done as soon as I can. All right, I hope you guys have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye.